Struggles. It's March 15, 2018. Something was interesting as I selected this for our topic this evening. The way we select topics is a process where we look at any new topics that might come up, or new books, or things that people suggest. But we also go back to old webinars from years ago, and we redo them if they haven't been done in our new format, in this new venue. And so I was going through the suggestion and got one of these suggestions, and I said it sounded good. And then as I started to go through the slides, what I realized was that there was a tremendous amount of overlap with some of the webinars, particularly some of the webinars that I've done lately. And so I'm going to try, this is more like, for me, a continuing conversation about some of the concepts that we've been talking about. In fact, even after the last webinar that's titled Another Webinar on Boundaries, I was thinking to myself about some of the ideas that I wanted to expand upon. So it worked out perfect for us to continue the discussion this evening. So tonight's broadcast is about avoiding the power struggle, and I'll visit on some of these webinars that I've listed here. The one that I just did recently, Another Webinar on Boundaries, Defenses, Trauma, and Diagnoses, and also motivational interviewing if you're interested in reading more about that. When I'm working with a family, when I'm working with some parents, one of the things that happens is they have an agenda, right? A worthy agenda to see some of their child's dangerous, maybe even life-threatening, or at least quality of life affecting symptoms reduce. And so at times when you're a therapist approaching the child and their struggles, sometimes the parents will feel at odds with you, that they seem to feel like they're not being heard or understood in the process, because sometimes what you're trying to explain as a therapist in terms of diagnoses or treatment planning or going forward with some parenting skills sounds like you're not on the same page. But one of the things I wanted to start off with this evening is to talk about the idea that the goals are the same, but we're going to try some non-common sense, some non-intuitive ways of responding to them. And so listen for that, ask about that with your Evoke therapist, and try to understand, okay, if this is my goal, if my goal, for example, is my child to reduce or stop completely any kind of substance use, or not struggle from depression or anxiety, or be able to deal with their social environment because they have autism spectrum disorder, or to be able to live independently, and you hear some of the things that the therapist is suggesting, ask them questions. You know, it's one of the things that they always tease me about in our program over the years, is when I say to parents, you have the right to ask difficult and critical questions. And your expectation that you have a right to is to have an intelligent, informed answer. But make sure when you're asking the question that you're listening to the answer. If your question, and I'm going to talk about this in regards to your children later on, if your question isn't a question, if it's a statement, try to get clear about that. Because sometimes the questions could be restated as statements like, I'm not feeling heard, or I'm not feeling like you're understanding where I'm coming from, or I don't think you're focusing on what you need to focusing on, whatever that is. So be as clear as you can about that. And then listen to the response, listen to what they have to say. And like I talked about just Monday night, you have a right to have your journey honored. There's a phrase sometimes in programs that is used that says, trust the process. And I think there's value in trusting the process. But trusting the process includes stating your concerns, your questions, your skepticism about the process, right? That's still your truth. And I think eventually, if over a long period of time, you can't get on board with what's happening, then I think it's about maybe this isn't the right thing for you, or it just doesn't fit for you. But far before we get to that threshold, I think it's okay to ask tough questions. I want to talk first of all in terms of the power struggle about the Serenity Prayer, and I didn't go ahead and print it on the slides tonight. I'll just quote it. Many of you already know it, and you can look it up. But it goes something like this: God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. The Al-Anon or the codependent serenity prayer has a slight variation. It goes like this: God, grant me the serenity to accept the people we cannot change, the courage to change the people we can, which is me, and the wisdom to know the difference. So it's a important thing to understand in terms of codependency, in terms of parenting, in terms of healthy boundaries. The first principle is, of course, is that you can't change your child. And just like I stated above, that doesn't mean that you can't be effective at encouraging change, at triggering change, at supporting change. It doesn't mean that you do nothing. People that are practicing the serenity prayer in their life, practicing recovery from codependency, and by the way, that really does go for all of us. Codependency is a continuum that we are all on somewhere, right? It's a pop psychology term for poor boundaries, poor understanding and connection with other people in our lives, a lack of clarity. So people that are practicing recovery, meaning that they are active in their work with learning how to deal with other people in their lives, especially those that they're close to, means that they are assertive, courageous, honest, clear, active, direct, and compassionate. So this is not a passive process. And I think, again, sometimes it's the failure of the therapist, and sometimes it's just that we don't hear it when it gets explained to us. That when somebody says, let go of the outcome, right? Or you can't control your child, or they have to want to change. That what gets heard by a parent or the person being taught that is, well, then I'm supposed to do nothing. I'm supposed to allow for anything. On the contrary, people in recovery for the codependency, that is, people that are working on improving their clarity in relationships, don't put up with anything. In fact, they're more specific about what they will and won't tolerate in their life and the boundaries that come along with that. So it doesn't mean passivity. It doesn't mean that you tolerate everything. What it does mean is that you find your truth, your values, what you believe in, what you want, what you think, and you act from that place very assertively and clearly, knowing that ultimately you can't cause the other person to change. I can set a boundary with your curfew. I can set a boundary with the car. I can set a boundary with whether or not I'm willing to support you in school if you're a young adult. I can set all the boundaries in the world, but what I can't do is make you change. And as a therapist, it's been quite a gift for me from your children over the years to be reminded of this often, because the particularly stubborn and disciplined ones really give you a run for your money, right? They're willing to cut off the proverbial nose to spite their face at a very severe, significant level. And so you get reminded every once in a while when you come across these very, very stubborn students, clients. And sometimes I would even thank them. I would say, thank you for reminding me that I'm not in control of everything, that I'm not in control of the universe. Sometimes I believe that because I am clever. I have had these debates. I can leverage a lot of consequences to encourage or even coerce change. And because I'm effective in those ways, I get lost. And a child that gets a particular power struggle with me reminds me of that. I used to ask this question years ago. I haven't asked it in quite some time. The thought experiment is simply this: who's in charge of you getting a raise at work? Who's in charge of you getting a raise in your salary, your income at work? And usually the answers when I ask parents this are pretty split, actually. 60-40, 50-50, 40-60, somewhere. People have different opinions. Some say it's your boss. Some say it's you. And what I say is, and just consider this idea, is that it's your boss. 100%. And let me illustrate. It's possible, all of us can imagine, it's possible to be the best, most talented employee in the entire company and get no raise. And it's also possible to be a really poor performing employee and get a raise. And we can imagine all kinds of scenarios where that exists. Now, talented bosses, smart bosses, effective bosses, consistently over time are going to reward the talented employees. But that's not always the case, right? And sometimes the economy happens in things that are outside of your control, right? What is your job at work in this thought experiment? Your job is to show up on time, to develop whatever skill set is required for the job, to demonstrate integrity, to learn, to be open, to be productive, right? We can make a whole list of things that are your responsibility in this thought experiment. But ultimately, it's not your decision to give you a raise if you're an employee. And if you find yourself, of course, in a company, in a position, in a job, in a career, where you find it, you experience it to be unfair, then you can move on. But you can't control somebody else. But here's my thought. So many of us in so many areas of life are so successful at manipulating other people that we buy into the illusion that we can control other people. That can be at home or in relationships. Many men and women are effective at manipulating people in their home or in relationships. Our younger children are much more susceptible to manipulation, intimidation, control, coercion. In the workforce or in the public sphere, many of us are very talented in various areas that allow us to be effective at getting people to do what we want them to do. And so again, we ultimately buy into that illusion that we can control other people, but ultimately it's not true. And I think, this is what I've said for years, that our children sometimes come to remind us of that idea, that we're not in control. So just like we talk about with your children, there is a piece of surrender that this process asks of you, a letting go. And again, surrender and letting go isn't passive. It is just what I've been talking about, understanding what you can and can't control and focusing on what you can control. Talk about the idea of alternatives to boundaries. What are boundaries? And this is something that I talk about, like I said, in those other broadcasts that I mentioned at the top of this broadcast. I've learned for many years now that oftentimes, most time, children don't need more data. They don't need more information. They seem like they do. They act ignorant, but they don't. They need very little data. In fact, they have heard your lectures, whether they act on them or not. They've heard them. And one of the ways that I know this is that they give them very quickly to everybody else in the group. Just like most of us, they become experts at everybody else's life relatively early in our program. They become the expert. I used to use this experiment with students and clients. I stopped using it after a few years because it never failed and I didn't need to do it anymore. But when I would have a child that was asking me, why can't I go home after Evoke? Why can't I call my parents? Why can't I write my girlfriend? Why can't I do this or that? And I learned, of course, relatively early on that no matter how articulate I was in my explanation, they never bought it. And so I learned that why did not mean why. Almost all of the time. It almost always means I don't like it, I disagree with it. And again, one of the ways you know this is if you explain to somebody why, if you answer the question why, and their response is, oh, that makes sense, now I see your side of things. I can see your perspective on this. Which, even as I say that, you can hear how ridiculous that is. It doesn't happen. So what I would do is I would say, I'll tell you what, when a child was particularly stuck in this why cycle, I would say, I'll give you a bag of M&Ms. Because M&Ms in the field, a bag of M&Ms in the field is the equivalent in our currency at home of about $10,000. That's what it feels like it's worth to the clients and students because they don't have access to a lot of sugar and sweets. So I would say to them, I'll give you a bag of M&Ms if you can tell me a reasonable explanation for why your parents want you to go on to a therapeutic school or program after Evoke, or why I don't recommend that you talk to your family right now, or write your girlfriend or your boyfriend, or whomever. And without me finishing the challenge, the invitation, clients and students would often start giving me a point-by-point detailed explanation of why. They don't like it, they don't agree with it, they don't endorse it, but they get it. It's not a cognitive problem, it's not a thought problem, it's an emotional problem. It gets couched in this intellectual context to invite you into a power struggle. But our temptation into the power struggle is this. If we can convince them, if we can get them to buy in, to like it, to want it, to see the value in what we're presenting to them, then we don't have to set boundaries. They'll just choose it. And then we won't have to deal with all of the fallout that comes from setting boundaries, like anger, right? Dislike, rejection, possibly a louder tantrum, because oftentimes when we finally set a boundary in a situation where they've been inconsistent or we've been reluctant, you're going to see an increase in the negative behavior. Initially, that's called an extinction burst. And so setting boundaries is the real hard work. Learning to reflective listen is a way of not engaging. I hear what you're saying. It makes sense. Initially, it's going to be difficult for you to do it, to just reflect. And you're going to worry that if I just reflect, then I'm not making my point, my counter argument. Or it sounds like I'm endorsing what they're saying. And they need to know that I disagree fundamentally with what they're stating or saying. But you can just let go of that. And over time, it doesn't happen immediately, but over time, as you shift into this more differentiated way of being with them, they'll start to learn that to listen and understand doesn't mean to agree. To listen and to understand doesn't mean to endorse. And to listen and to understand means that you're handing it back to them. So many parents will ask me questions like, how do I help my child get over this or that? The feeling of resentment, forgiveness, anger, whatever it is. And my answer is you don't. You let them have it. You let it wash over or through you. You find a way to become grounded enough in yourself, in your truth, that you're okay with whatever they feel and think. You don't, even in the littlest bit, try to argue or debate or convince them otherwise. You even go to a farther extent and you empathize and you understand and you acknowledge that they might be right in some cases. You might be wrong. You get out of the paradigm actually of right and wrong. And I talked a lot about this on Monday. You learn how to lose. It's one of my favorite phrases lately. Learn how to lose. You don't get to be right anymore. And being right in families and relationships is one of the most unenlightened places to be. It's what school children think about. It's what many of our families taught us. It's what our culture teaches us and our society teaches us. But enlightened individuals don't need to be right. They just are okay with being them. So reflective listening can kind of maintain the boundary, demonstrate listening, and avoid power struggles. And you share from the I perspective, right? I feel, I think, I believe, this is what I feel comfortable with, what I'm okay with, those kinds of statements. This is my experience, but I'm not trying to be right. Like I said, lack of understanding is not a cognitive barrier. You know, I was thinking about this as I was rewriting these slides for tonight's broadcast. Some of the current trends, and I've seen these in just the last week. I think it was Oprah who was on 60 Minutes last week and was talking about childhood trauma. And Gabor Mate was talking about the connection between addiction and trauma in some recent literature. This is what mental health professionals have known for decades. Mental health lens, right, looks at symptoms through the lens of what's the core issue, what's the wound, what's the hurt, what's the fear. Trauma are the new buzzwords, is a new buzzword out there in our society, but it's been there for mental health professionals for years. And so the mental health lens is not common sense. And that's why I said in the last section, we're going to try to talk about things in a different way. Same goal, same outcome that you want, but we're going to take a different approach. And of course, just like we say to your children, what has been tried in the past isn't working for anybody. For you, for them, for anybody. So let's try something different. And that's not a blind trust, but that's a critical and novel approach to a problem. I talk about this all the time, not engaging defenses. And defenses are just another word for symptoms, right? That's the universal problem. Anything as mild as sarcasm and passive-aggressive language to severe self-medication and suicidality, right? Any symptom that serves to protect the individual from what Carl Jung calls a more legitimate suffering, right? Just by natural observation early in my career, I realized it was rather simple, that people's symptoms protected them from hurting, from vulnerable, uncomfortable feelings, from grief, from sadness, from fear. And that pattern applies to both the children in our program and the parents. So getting out of it for them and for you is going to be uncomfortable, foreign, novel. It's going to go against your grain. It's going to be non-intuitive. At some level, it's not going to make sense. Some other level, it still can make sense. But at some level, it's not going to make sense. And your natural impulses are going to run contrary to the solution. So the most important thing is to share your vulnerability. That's why I talked about on Monday. That's why I talk about often. Find something to say you're sorry about. Find something to own that is your flaw. Find something to focus on that is your symptom, your defense, your wall. The best way to encourage the lowering of your child's defense, the thing that they've built around them to protect them from what they perceive as threats, the best way to do that is to lower your defense. And I'm going to be almost facetious. And I don't mean for this to be sarcastic or trite or superficial. But it is to say to your child, I know I'm an idiot. I know being my son or my daughter is not easy. I know I have a lot of baggage. I make mistakes all the time, and I'm sorry. And I'm not always right. And I react out of my own unresolved traumas and issues in my life, out of my own unenlightenment at times. And I recognize that. And I want to have compassion for how that must be for you. Right? That's the best thing that we can do. It doesn't matter if they are, symptomatically speaking, 50 times, 100 times worse than you. It doesn't matter. And the fear is, of course, for parents that if I take that accountability, that I'm not making them accountable. Right? That I'm not telling them what they need to know. I will tell you this very, very simply, folks. What we know in mental health is banging up against somebody's defenses, pointing them out, doesn't do much. It really doesn't. Sometimes you see examples of therapists or sponsors or somebody in the treatment community really challenging somebody, but that comes in the context of a fantastic amount of love and trust. It comes from some other places. But for us parents, for most of us, for us therapists who are being lazy or aren't approaching something with the best of training or skills, banging up against somebody's defenses is nonsense. We become, in some sense, the reason for the defense. So the best way to do it is to lower yours, to look at your stuff. I cannot be more clear than to say this, folks. The best thing that you can do to help your child is to do your work. More and more and more. And it, like I said the last couple of broadcasts, it takes years. It's not years before we see any results, but it takes years to make substantial changes. But just making that our project makes a difference. The shame, the judgment that we have for our children, the fact that we're standing up on this pedestal, and that they're giving us plenty of reason to stand up on a pedestal because they're doing idiotic things, dramatically stupid, irresponsible, unhealthy things. I know that that's true. But getting up on the pedestal and staying there doesn't help. That's why as a therapist, you work on containing, you work on understanding without compromising your own boundaries. That's important. Again, just because you have compassion for the wildest of behaviors doesn't mean that comes at the cost of your boundaries and the heroic work that it is to establish, set, and maintain boundaries. The idea is to use a mental health lens, and that's a non-intuitive. It's not even pop psychology. I read so much in the media that purports itself to be psychology and therapy. That's just pop psychology. It's just somebody with a degree or some training that's repackaging because they have some new language, common sense ideas. If you do this work, most people will think you're stupid or crazy or doing it wrong. You will not, in many cases, fit into the mainstream, right? So changing your lens from common sense, from society's ideas, to a deeper mental health lens that comes at the outcome, comes from a lot of work that you do, is most effective. Look underneath the root issue rather than focusing on a behavioral change. This idea that I've been talking about lately, being right versus being you, right? Learn to be you. I'll repeat myself. You don't get to be right anymore if you're going to do it this way. You just get to be you. And that is so much of a more powerful place to be. Learn how to lose. Learn how to not win. Embrace being wrong. Come and make friends with your own darkness, your own wrongness, your own idiocy. And again, all of that doesn't come at the cost of saying, but this is going to be my stance. Maybe I should let you get high in the house. Maybe that would be a more enlightened stance. Maybe that would be a larger container. Maybe that would be something else, but I'm not okay with it. And then again, this question of how do you teach accountability? My answer is this is how you teach it. I've told the story of a mother when a son blamed her in a very powerful family therapy session, blamed her for his lying because of how judgmental and controlling she had been. And she said to him, without my coaching, you're right. I have been judgmental and controlling. I understand. And after he left the session and we were wrapping it up, she turned to me and she said, but Brad, how do I teach him accountability and that he's responsible for his part? And I said, you just did. That's how you do it. Every one of you who's been in an intimate relationship, a companion relationship, knows the effect when your companion takes responsibility for their side. You are tremendously more likely to own your part versus when their arrows are pointed at you. It's so easy to be critical and point out somebody else's defensive, and it's so heroic and difficult to look at it and address our own. Stay on our side of the street, as they say on Al-Anon. Work on your side of the street, cleaning up your side of the street. What gets in the area, what gets in the The way of us doing this work, well, it's our fear. Right? Fear is the problem. If our fear runs us, we're not going to get it right. Fear translates into anger and control. So we go to places to work out our fear. We take back the responsibility for our own feelings and our own serenity. Your anger, your frustration, your sadness, your grief, your fear, your joy, your sense of pride or proudness for somebody else, it's all yours to own. It's yours. Logically, I could see that you all have good reasons to be afraid. No doubt about it. I wouldn't be in this program if that weren't true. But it's yours to work on, to manage somewhere else. You go to Al-Anon, you go to Coda, you go to a therapist. You visit and deal with your fear there so that you can come home and you can respond to your child from your highest self. I'm not saying don't be afraid. I'm not saying your fear isn't deserved. I'm saying don't let it drive you. It's not your highest self. It won't serve you. It ought to inform you, but it ought not to be in charge of the controls. Our own shame, our own difficulty in looking at our own stuff, our need to be a good father or mother, a good person. Right? There's almost nothing more sensitive to most of us than our role as a parent. And for somebody or something to critique that, or to suggest that we're less than good, is one of the most terrifying considerations of all. But this work that I'm describing, folks, this work of therapy and Al-Anon and Coda and all this work, it gets you beyond that. It really does. After a while, you can be like a Gandhi or the Dalai Lama and make fun of yourself and talk about what a numbskull you are. And you're not compromised when you say that. You've just become friends with your humanity, with your humanness. So shame is the barrier. I talked about the alternatives to boundaries. All these things that we think are boundaries: teaching, begging, threatening, sharing feelings even. I'll talk about that. I'll emphasize that in a moment. Nagging, lecturing, moralizing, debating, arguing, pleading, coaxing, intimidating, on and on and on. Many of those are similar, and there are more than that. But these are all alternatives to boundaries. I want to be clear. These are not boundaries. These are not boundaries. Telling somebody how you feel is not a boundary. Telling your child how upset, disappointed, worried, frustrated, angry, telling them that is not a boundary. And it's not their responsibility for you to feel okay. And the simplest illustration is the idea that, imagine if you have a religious preference. Let's imagine if you do. Or imagine if your child, if somebody came to you and said, let's say I was Jewish, right? Wouldn't matter if I was Jewish or Christian or Muslim, whatever it is, or atheist or Buddhist. Let's say, just for the sake of discussion, I'm Jewish. And somebody comes to me and says, I want to convert to Judaism, but my parents are angry and upset and want to disown me. What should I do? And I'm Jewish, and they're telling me this, right? Would I say, well, you should stay in the religion that your parents believe in, regardless of how you feel, right? That's nonsense. I've used the example with my own mother. My own mother, I think maybe, my own mother absolutely loves me, adores me, thinks I've turned out wonderfully. And at the top of her wish list would be that I would adopt her religious preference. And it doesn't consume her to the point that it makes her life miserable, but it's a sad thing for her. But I'm not going to do anything about that. It's not my job. And we could expand that to be a whole bunch of other examples where it's not a child's job to make a parent happy. It's not a child's job to take care of the parent's serenity. It's not a child's job to make their parent proud. It's not a child's job to make the parent sleep at night. Now, when we wake up as children, right? If I'm doing drugs, cutting on myself, lying, cheating, stealing, whatever it is, when I wake up, when I start to heal, when I start to see what I'm doing, to feel, because I'm in a safe place and I can do it and I have the courage to do it, I of course see how I've affected my loved ones. I of course see how my stealing, my lying, my yelling, but that's not why you stop doing it. You stop doing it because it's ruining your life. Right? So even sharing feelings is not a boundary. It's an excuse or an alternative for boundaries often. Red light language, I talk about this all the time, using imperatives. You must, you should, you ought to, or absolutes like you always or you never, or moralizing in terms of right and wrong. Those tend to shut down defenses, shut down conversations, and raise defenses and the power struggle. And then, of course, over-identifying with our children. A lack of separating what they feel or think or believe or react to, we take on as if it's about us, right? They become, in essence, a mirror for us rather than their own individual self. So what are the take-home principles? Communication skills are separate from boundaries and behavioral responses. And a lot of the communication skills, even that we teach, can be weaponized to become a power struggle. So a boundary is just what I'm willing to do or not do, what I'm willing to support or not support. And ultimately, I realize I can't stop you. But that's not going to cause me to be inactive in my life and passive with my boundaries. I think about this in terms of pragmatism, what works. In the book, the webinar, the podcast, motivational interviewing, we learn that the research suggests that pragmatically attacking defenses, going at somebody, increases the power struggle. It doesn't diminish it. The treatment outcomes there are there, folks. It doesn't diminish the power struggle. Let them feel, think, and believe what they want. They don't have to like it and be happy about it. Separate the boundaries and the limits from the emotional coercion, the shaming, intimidating messages. Be with them on the journey, meaning that you have your own journey, and I honor that. And all the wounds that bring you to this point to struggle on your side of the equation, I honor. And try to get into those. And you can even feel, as I suggest that many of you, the vulnerability that takes, the fear that is, the loss of control that is. It seems so counterintuitive to what we're trying to do, which is save our children's life, those people that we love the most, that we've been charged with taking care of and supporting. Do your own work. Do your own work. All the way from going to therapy or Al-Anon or Codependence Anonymous or Families Anonymous, which are free, right? Those 12-step group meetings, to doing your own intensive, hiring your own therapist, come to a Finding You. It makes the biggest difference. You see, you have new eyes, new ears, new tools. It's a wonderful experience. Like I said, do your work and establish and maintain clarity, and then shift it from a mental health lens versus the lenses in society that they suggest that we ought to look at children and people through. Typically, it's a right or a wrong or a religious lens. Mental health professionals don't see it that way. We don't look at it that way. I mean, some do. Those who have just been educated often do. But those who have swam in it don't look at it that way. They don't. They know that hatred doesn't cure hatred, that shame doesn't cure symptomology, that judgment might temporarily, as shame does, motivate somebody to change, but it doesn't address and heal the core issue at hand. All right, any questions? No questions yet. I'll go through the upcoming events and slides and announcements. If there are any questions at the end, I'll pause. We, like I said, ask all parents to go to 6 12-step meetings while your child is with us. If you haven't started now, no matter where you are in the process, we strongly invite you to try out 6 meetings. They're not just for family members of drug addicts and alcoholics. They're for anybody in relationship. Al-Anon, CODA, or Families Anonymous. You can also go to NAMI.org to find local resources, classes in your area. All of these broadcasts are available also through the podcast app on your Apple or iOS device. Go to the podcast app and search Evoke Therapy Program. If you have an Android device or on your computer, you can go to the SoundCloud webpage or download the SoundCloud app on your Android device and search Evoke Therapy Programs there. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram for articles and resources and inspirational quotes, pictures, and stories. On Facebook, you can search Evoke Therapy Programs and follow us there for all kinds of resources. The Evoke Family Therapy Foundation, newly named, I should say, is a foundation. You can go to Facebook and find it. A foundation to help people that can't afford therapy. So if you want to give back or become involved, you can go there. Go to our Evoke Therapy Program blog for continuous new content. You can find my book, The Journey of the Heroic Parent, that's available on Amazon for audio version there. The next workshop that we invite all parents, if you possibly can, if you have the time and the resources, we want all current parents to come to a workshop. The next one is at Entrada, April 21st and 22nd. And contact Gail at evoketherapy.com for more information. Multifamily, some field experience, parent education. If it's an appropriate time for your child to receive a visit, you can combine that with a visit. So we want all parents to come. If you want to do deeper work, if you want to do some of what I was talking about tonight, you have the time and the resources. The next Finding You is April 18th through 22nd in Park City, Utah at our new Summit Lodge. You can also do a private family intensive. Those are customized. And if you're a professional listening to this broadcast, we've also started professional growth workshops. So this is not for parents. These are not for parents. The professional growth workshops are for therapeutic professionals, treatment providers in the field, if they want to do some of their own work together with other treatment professionals. Email intensives@evoketherapy.com for more questions, or go to our website. I'll be in New York on Tuesday, March 20th, 7 to 9 p.m. in Midtown, Orange County on, that's not Tuesday, March 25th, that should say Sunday, March 25th. Newport Beach, California, 4 to 5 is a potluck, 7 to 9 is, excuse me, that should be 5 to 7 is the parenting meeting. So that slide is a little bit off. Potluck 4 to 5, meeting from 5 to 7 in Newport Beach. We're also going to Portland, Seattle, and the Bay Area coming up soon. I'm also going to be speaking to a school in Orange County, so if you want to come out to that, that's Monday the 26th in Trabuco Canyon. I'm going to be talking about raising resilient children amidst today's societal changes, really about what it means to help somebody develop a self in a child and combat some of what we're seeing in terms of the suicidality in our children. If you want to do a pursuits program as a family, or if you have a young adult, think of adventure therapy, therapy light, sober fun. That's what that's about. All right, any questions? First question, how do you recommend talking about new boundaries? From now on, I will not give you your phone without it sounding or being a lecture. That's a great question. I get asked this a lot. Just shorter is, you could just say I've changed. See, very, very short. And when they ask you why, if you get too long, you're trying to explain it or make it sound good or have them like it. And I'll be ridiculous just to make a point. You can say, I've just changed my mind. I just have this new idea. And if they say why, you can say, here's what I'm thinking. And if they argue with you, you'll say, okay, that's how you can get out of the why cycle, is if they say why and you answer why, and then they have a rebuttal, then you know that it's not going to go anywhere. So just keep it short. You don't have to justify it. You know, justifying it again is about being right. You don't have to justify it. And they don't have to, they can get through the adjustment. And when they come to us, as you know, they adjust to dramatically different boundaries without a lot of explanations or justifications. Next question. I recently apologized to my son, and he deflected the apology by changing the subject. Suggestions on how to handle that. Great question. They'll do that. You don't do it for an outcome. You do it because it's generous, it's loving, and it's courageous. And they will often deflect, change the subject, or tell you it's okay. But that's not why you're doing it. Over time, it's more of a way of being with them. The apology is just a specific skill. Don't give up on it. Continue to do it. That's the way to be with them. The 10th step and then the 12th step is about making a daily amends. It's just saying, I'm a project too. I have faults and flaws, and they come out all the time. And it's the opposite of, I'm right. And I'm the parent, and I know everything. And you're the problem. And I'm here to just give you my truth, right? It's just a different sensibility. Thank you. Next question. I find myself being halting and hesitant and cautious in talking with my son because I don't want to violate the 8 tips or say the wrong thing or say it the wrong way. He ends up being impatient and frustrated with me when I talk. What do I try to focus on here? I think that's wonderful. I think that's wonderful that it's not automatic for you, that you stumble through it and that he gets frustrated with you. If you're like most of us, you're better at most things than he is. You're smarter and more accomplished. So it's nice for you to stumble through some stuff. So what I would say is just embrace it. Embrace the fact that it doesn't come to you automatically and that you're going to make mistakes and that you're not going to do it smoothly, at least for a while, and that you're going to stumble. And when he gets frustrated, that's an opportunity to really give him, to honor him, and to, again, respond with the sensibility of, makes sense, I'm sorry, I'm not very good at this, I wish I was. I had this really difficult childhood from parents who loved me, but this really difficult childhood and upbringing in our culture that left me with few insights in this area, and so I'm just learning new stuff, and I can totally understand your frustration. I'd be frustrated if I was you too. The name of my book is The Journey of the Heroic Parent, but you're talking about the name of the book where we talk about the research is Motivational Interviewing. Goes back to this slide right here. Motivational Interviewing. In fact, I have it right here, if this is the one you're talking about. Next question. How would my husband benefit from finding you versus a 2-day parent workshop? They're very similar work. It's like, think of, what would I say? Think about, I guess the best way, it's using an analogy. The 2-day parent workshop is parent education, it's experiential, you're close to your child, so maybe you can combine that with a visit. Finding you is like going on an internship and helping children in India with leprosy, right? You learn something there that you can't learn in any other way, versus going to college and taking a semester of really cool and inspiring classes. So it's a deeper level of work at finding you. I value both of them. Finding you takes more time, is much more expensive. The workshops take less time, are much more affordable. It's multifamily and it's more educational. The Finding You is much more experiential and therapeutic. But they're complementary and both very valuable, and you come out with some of the same things both ways. Finding You, you're gonna look much more deeply at what are my wounds, what are my traumas, what's my barriers. Whereas in the workshop, it's going to be about education, skill building, practical takeaways, those kinds of things. Is it possible to draw too many boundaries? I mean, according to who? As I've gotten older, I'm more clear about my boundaries. The more I practice this, I'm more clear. I've let go of some. I have a greater capacity to tolerate some things without getting offended, hurt, or threatened by them. So in those ways, I don't need those boundaries anymore. On the other hand, I'm very clear about what I won't and will tolerate, and I'm much more courageous at asserting my boundaries in those areas. So it's kind of a both kind of thing. And let me say this, because this is a great question. This is a great question. Harriet Lerner, in her book, The Dance of Anger, which is a great book on boundaries, says, in the initial phases of this work, people will often go through what she calls the obnoxious phase. The obnoxious phase. And the reason she says that is she's saying, give yourself a little freedom to bumble through it and to do it wrong. And when people accuse you of doing it wrong, that's okay. Just like I said to the parent who asked the question about the 8 tips, you're going to make mistakes. You're going to evolve. You don't have to get it right. Do it perfectly. So be compassionate and patient with yourself. And when people accuse you of setting too many or too little, your response is, you might be right. I'm kind of new to this. We recently allowed our son to find his own therapist after rejecting the 3 that we had found prior. He is completely bought in with her. Is this as simple as, is it as simple as that to get them to buy in? I mean, that's a great idea. It's too specific of a situation for me to apply a kind of a general principle, but what you did sounds great. I mean, the question I would ask is, do you get a sense that he's just resistant to therapy at all? If that's an expectation of yours and a boundary of yours? Or, I mean, I had a parent write me today saying they're having a hard time finding a therapist and asked if I had any recommendations. And so, and I have the broadcast, the podcast webinar on what to look for in a therapist and the blog on what to look for in a therapist. So I'm very particular. So I think it sounds like you handled it very well. Can we combine a visit with our child while attending Finding You? Yes, absolutely. Many people have. If you're from far away and you come to Park City and your child is at Entrada, it's a 4-hour drive down to Entrada. So if you're traveling a long distance, it's an easy trip to make. If your Evoke therapist says that the timing is appropriate, absolutely. So thank you. Thanks for all the questions and attendance, folks. Great to be with you. Wonderful being on this journey with all of you all the time. I honor your process and on behalf of your child, thanks for showing up and listening to something different and trying something different and trying to embrace the idea of you don't get to win, learn how to lose, and you don't get to be right anymore. Have a great week. I'll talk to you Monday, the 19th, March 19th at 7 p.m. Mountain Time. Take care, folks. Bye-bye.